Morning.
The May 1st, 2019 meeting of the Board of Estimates is now called to order. In the interest of promoting the order and efficiency of these hearings, persons who are disruptive to the hearing will be asked to leave the hearing room. Meetings of the Board of Estimates are open to the public for the duration of the meeting. The hearing room must be vacated at the conclusion of the meeting. Failure to comply may result in the charge of trespassing. Madam Deputy Comptroller, are there any corrections, additions, deferrals on the agenda?
Good morning. For today's agenda, there is one correction. There are no deferrals. For page 88, item number 1, under travel requests, under the header name for the first item, it currently reads Deborah, D-E-B-R-A. That is misspelled. That should be Deborah, D-E-B-O-R-A-H. So that will now read Deborah Moore Carter. We have several protests. For page 47, a protest is received from Ms. Kim Trueheart as co-director of the Liberty Rec and Tech Center. On page 54, 2 protests were received. One was from the Friends of the Gwynns Falls Leakin Park through Mr. Lattimore. The second protest was from Mr. George Ferrant. And for pages 65 to 67, a protest was received from Nia Redmond, representing East Baltimore Historical Library, Inc. The items that will be on the non-routine agenda are page 1, which is the presentation on the ordinance of estimates, page 47, page 54 for City Council Bill 180298, and pages 65 to 67. I have the following abstentions to report. For the Honorable Mayor Young, he will abstain on pages 50 to 51, pages 52 to 54. The Honorable President Middleton will abstain on page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, pages 50 to 51, page 52 to 54, and pages 63 to 64. The Honorable Comptroller Pratt will abstain on page 88, item number 1, pages 88 to 89, item number 2, page 96, item 15, pages 97 to 98, item number 16 and 17. And again, the items on the non-routine agenda are page 1, page 47, page 54, City Council Bill 180298, and pages 65 to 67. Madam President and members of the board, those are the corrections to the agenda, the protests received, as well as the abstentions that have been reported thus far. Thank you.
Thank you. I firstly would like to recognize the former Honorable Councilwoman Ricky Spector has joined us today, and also Honorable Councilman Robert Stokes has joined us today. I would direct the board members' attention to the memorandum of the President's Office dated April 29, 2019, identifying matters to be considered as routine agenda items, together with any corrections and additions that have been noted by the Deputy Comptroller. I will entertain a motion to approve all the items. We'll hold off on the motion. What's going on?
Just 1 minute.
Okay, starting here, okay. It's page 93 to 96, and it's item numbers 8, number 8 to 14. Okay. Excuse me, if I may, there's one additional deferral, and that is in the travel section on pages 93 through 96 for items numbers 8 through 14. Those items will be deferred for 1 week. Thank you.
I will entertain a motion to approve all the items contained on the routine agenda.
Madam President, I move approval of all the items on the routine agenda.
I second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. The motion carries. The routine agenda items have been adopted. The first item on the non-routine agenda can be found on page 1. The Department of Finance will present the proposed ordinance of estimates for FY 2020 and an ordinance to levy and collect a tax and request authorization to advertise the ordinance of estimates. Director Bob Canamy? Bob Senemy.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Bob Sedemy, Budget Director for the city, and I'm here today to present 2 items for the board's consideration. First is the fiscal 2020 ordinance of estimates, and also the proposed property tax ordinance for fiscal 20. So the proposed ordinance includes $2.9 billion of operating expenses among all funds. That's an increase of $109 million, or 3.9% versus the fiscal 19 appropriation. It also includes $627 million of capital investment. The total budget between operating and capital among all funds is $3.5 billion. Looking at the general fund only, the operating budget is proposed at $1.9 billion. That's a 3.2% increase versus the fiscal 19 budget. The proposed property tax ordinance is at $2.248 per $100 of assessed value. That's the same rate as last year. The personal property tax by law is 2.5 times that rate, which is $5.62 per $100 of assessed value. Between the release of the preliminary budget when we came to you on March the 27th, between that time and today, we've taken a number of steps to finalize this budget. First, more formally, was on April 9th, we had our annual taxpayers night to get feedback from our citizens. We had a special session of the board on April 11th, which was an opportunity for the board members to provide their feedback with agency heads present. And concurrently, my team and our staff has worked with agency personnel to finalize their line item budgets. You'll notice in the final budget, there's very few changes. Most of the changes are on the state funds, where we get the final information from the state budget as it wraps up in April and reflect that in our final ordinance. The general fund recommendation remains unchanged between the preliminary and the executive summary. The next step in the process after approval today is for the ordinance to be introduced into City Council, and then there will be formal council hearings agency by agency that are scheduled for June. So with that, I would ask the board to approve those 2 items, and happy to answer any questions that the board has on that.
Madam President, if there are no questions for Mr. Sinema, I would move that the board adopt and approve the recommended ordinance of estimates for fiscal year 2020, and that authorization be given to advertise that budget and transmit same to the City Council.
I second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The motion carries.
Thank you.
The second item on the non-routine agenda can be found on page 47, Department of Recreation and Parks Amendment, number 1 to Memorandum of Understanding. Will the parties please come forward?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Reginald Moore, Director for Baltimore City Recreation and Parks, and I have C.R. Harris
Stand
on
on
this
the
side.
left.
That we're here to recommend the amendment to the current school MOU be accepted by the board.
Okay. Kim?
Thank you. Kim Trueheart, state your name.
Good morning. I'm Kim Trueheart, and I protested this item because, as normal, this government seems to think that it doesn't need to be transparent about things that occur that impact every citizen, but in particular our children. This item addresses a very contentious issue in communities where legacy rec centers that were attached to schools have often been demolished as part of the 21st century program, and communities were told that there would be adequate space, up to 3,000 square feet, in the new 21st century buildings for communities to use. And one of the challenges has always been prioritization of use, how to go about getting reservations to use. And I think our government needs to do a better job around ensuring communities do have access to that community space. And at this point, I'm not clear what the value of having rec and parks in the middle of determining when communities use the space, what the protocols are for their use, and it just seems like another bureaucratic layer in that process. This item was presented at the school board a couple of weeks ago. Public never got a chance to see the actual amendment, and I'm thankful that this week, because of my protest, I actually got to see the memorandum and the language in the memo. But I ask that this board be more transparent in the things that you do, especially when they have a direct impact on our children, our communities, and we still have a ways to go.
Comptroller Pratt has a question.
I had a couple of questions. Yeah. Was there an opportunity for the community to provide input prior to the decision being made?
Comptroller Pratt, I would like to clarify that this is not the original MOU. The original MOU was approved in February of 2016. This is an amendment to clarify there were some questionable areas or defining what is Rec and Parks role, what is the school system role. So this is not the original MOU. This was for us to move forward and get into our first school, which was Fort Worthington. We had to clarify the use of equipment. Who was responsible for the equipment? How would we use rooms? How would we determine the schedule? How would the two parties determine if there's a conflict in the schedule? So this is what this does. It's not the original MOU.
But that's the item of contention.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. I happen to agree that, where there were rec centers attached to schools, it should still be recreational property. I know it's been difficult throughout the years for recs and parks being in school buildings. School buildings are really the city's buildings anyway, because when the schools decide to close the schools, we're left with a bond debt. Right now, we are facing $890,000 that we have to pay back to the state in bond money for Pimlico that was closed. These are the kind of things that really gets to make my skin boil. And what the school system have to understand, and I hope they are here, is that these school buildings do not belong just to you. They belong to the citizens of Baltimore. And they need to be open for the public to be able to use them. It's public money. We have to pay, like I said, $890,000 on a bond debt because the school system is not looking at that. They're looking at closing schools. And the schools that have these bond debts on, they need to pause. We're a poor city. We can't afford to pay off these bond debts. In some kind of way, I asked Henry Raymond to figure out how the school system can be held accountable for their own bond debt. It's getting ridiculous. These 21st century schools, where a rec center used to be, They need to be open, and it needs to be Recs and Parks that runs them. As simple as that. These are the same children who attend the schools in the same community. We shouldn't even be arguing about this. We shouldn't even be discussing it. In New Jersey, they have the schools open up all night, where young people are in the schools instead of in the streets. And we need to get this together. And we need to make sure that there's a clear partnership with a clear MOU that states that these places, these spaces are used for the community. If they're community schools, let's make sure they're real community schools. And stop playing games. That's all I have to say.
And one other thing, I think it's important that when the decision is made to tear down a rec center, that we also need to start that conversation about replacing it.
Absolutely.
And our capital planning folks need to participate in that conversation, and there needs to be money other than the 21st century funding to rebuild that rec center. Our communities have suffered too long from closures and demolishing of rec centers. When I was a kid, there was 155 rec centers in this city, and now we're down to 40-some. That's outrageous, and I understand we've lost population, but the services and programs that our kids need aren't being provided, and I know we can do better. And so under your
Is anybody, excuse me, not to cut you off, anybody here from the school system? Well, they need to come up.
And can I say one thing before Nicole?
Yes.
One of the things I want to clarify is we have been strengthening our relationships with the school, and we've been working with the school, and we've been working.
I understand that, but it hasn't always been that way. And we need to make sure that it's that way from here on. The schools ultimately belongs to the city.
And Ms. Trueheart, your comments are definitely well noted. Thank you. Representatives of the Baltimore City Public Schools, state your name.
Yep. Good morning. My name is Nicole Price, Director of Community and Public Relations for the 21st Century Buildings Program. Director Moore is correct. What's before you today is amendments to the original MOU to clarify a number of things that were not clarified in the original MOU that was signed in February 2016. Since then, we've been working with Recs and Parks. We've been meeting at least monthly, but most often we meet twice a month to go over all the different items included in the MOU and to come to some consensus and agreement about how to move forward. Fort Worthington Elementary Middle School, which opened in September 2017, was one of the first schools opened under the 21st Century Program. And this January, we were able to reach agreement with Recs and Parks, where we entered a pilot, and that school is now being used as a satellite program for recreation parks. So it is the first of the many 21st Century schools that open, but it's also the first that's sort of where we have a pilot. The goal and objective to launch that pilot in January was to continue with this agreement, but also look at how do you actually share space. I think it's one thing to put on paper to say, this is how we're going to do it. Implementation is very different. It's easy to agree in paper, but once you get into implementation, you don't really know what's going to happen. And so we're continuing to looking at what's happening at Fort Worthington to continue to make sure that the relationship works going forward for other schools like Dorothy I. Height, Frederick, and Walter B. Carter. I think there's a couple of misconceptions. Excuse me, I'm actually a little under the weather, so I think there are a couple of misconceptions. I think there's a conception that all of the schools within 21st Century that have a recreation center attached to them are being demolished, and Recs and Parks are losing all of those spaces. That's incorrect. John Ruhr Elementary Middle School, which opens this January, the rec center was attached to the school. When it opens in January, we're hoping to do a joint ceremony, ribbon cutting, with the renovations that are being done to the rec center as well as the school. Mary E. Robin, which will open in September 2021, that rec center also will remain. Northwood, that rec center will also remain. So it is not every school that has a rec center attached in the 21st century where rec centers are being demolished. In the event that when the architects complete the feasibility study or planning for a school building, if there's no way to accommodate the number and projected enrollment for students, then in those cases, the rec centers are being either demolished or repurposed for educational space. Those schools are the ones I mentioned: Fort Worthington, Frederick, Walter B. Carter and Dorothea Height, in which this agreement reflects. The other thing I will say is I think there's also a conception that when the schools are built, Rex won't be able to operate in those spaces, or that the 3,000 square foot is solely dedicated to recreation and parks. Ex officio mayor mentioned community schools. In cases like Fort Worthington, that is where the YF Central Maryland is a community school and provide additional services to students in that school, mostly during the school day, but also sometimes in the evening hours after school ends. The part where that really has to be worked out is in implementation is how the YF Central Maryland that provides those services to the students during the school day and beyond works with Rex and Parks to make sure that both can operate in the building. That's really where the discussion comes in and how both of those two entities coexist. So for Fort Worthington, it's YF Central Maryland. For Dorothea Height, it's Child First. For Frederick, it's actually Baltimore Curriculum Project. And for Walter P. Carter, it's also YF Central Maryland.
Thank you, Ms. Price.
I want to go back up for a minute. You say some of the schools that have Rex attached to them will be demolished.
Some of them. So Fort Worthington, Dorothea.
I know about Fort Worthington, but who makes that decision to demolish rec centers?
That is made, it is, the architect does a feasibility study on all of the buildings. That feasibility study normally includes 3, sometimes as many as 10 different options. So an example of Walter B. Carter, there were 11 options that were explored, and there were attempts to save the recreation center and build the school around it. But without going into a lot of detail, given the topography and complications of the site, it couldn't be saved. Once that decision is, once a recommendation is looked at, it goes to the school board, it comes to the city, and it goes to the state. And all of those entities have to agree and approve the feasibility study before it can move forward for design and construction. So it is, it starts with Baltimore City Schools, but it is moved on to the city as well as the state and the Maryland Stadium Authority for all 4 partners in the MOU to agree and approve that plan.
Okay, well, I would like for, if those kind of scenarios happen, that Mr. Moore, you're at the table so that we can make sure that our rec centers are part of the school where we still have control of the rec centers, because to me, it seems backwards. If it was our rec property, it should remain our rec property within the school system. Because what people fail to realize, the schools, even though we have Baltimore City Public Schools, they have their CEO and their own board, that's still city property, because at the end, we get it back. And when we get it back with a huge bond debt on it. You know, and for a city like Baltimore that's struggling to raise money, I mean, we have kids who we can't find funding for all the kids who want to work. That $890,000 and all the money that we've been paying back. I asked Henry to get me a printout of how much bond debt we have to get back to the state, because our school system make the decision to close schools. And if they close them with bond debt, they should eat it. Yeah, thank you.
And if I can just say one thing. Fort Worthington, Fredericks, and Dorothea Heights was signed, sealed, and delivered really before I got here. With Walter B. Carter, our team has worked closely with the schools team, our capital team, to make sure that there was space that was conducive for Rec and Park. But Nicole's correct. Someone in the mayor's office signs off on all plans, and I'm not sure who that person, but
We'll find out who it is.
But that's who's approved everything that moved forward. It was somebody in the mayor's office.
Okay.
Thank you. I will entertain a motion.
Madam President, if you think it would be helpful, perhaps council can explain very briefly what some of the items that needed clarification in the memorandum.
Yes, counsel, can you explain?
Just very briefly.
Your name, please.
My name is Hanarez Kondratuk. I'd like to just clarify some of the additional language that's in the agreement. First and foremost, we clarify exactly what the MOU is intended to cover, what schools are being impacted by it. We identify, we fixed spellings of, corrected spellings of the various schools. We provided language to protect equipment. So there was an issue back and forth with the school and Rec and Parks for when space is being used, how expensive digital equipment would be handled. So that was a holdup for us to be able to move into the school. So that was addressed. Security was addressed. There were some disagreements with who was responsible for securing the space when Rec and Parks was occupying it versus the school program. Repair obligations, and clarifying certain language in the license agreement, which will be the draft for each school when Rec and Parks enters into it and occupies it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Trueheart?
Just as a final point, at the decision point to demolish a rec center, I think we have to come up with a strategy to replace it. And that has not happened. And I think it's very important that our planning department, the capital planners, get on that because it is clear the state does not want us to use 21st century schools funding for recreational uses or community uses. And these rec centers, when they're demolished, take away space that community organizations use, take away recreational opportunities, take away a lot of the lifeline that communities need. And I don't think we've adequately addressed replacing that. Thank you.
Well, if you heard me, I said that if they tear down the rec center, it should be incorporated right back into that system with that space and should be controlled by Recs and Parks.
Thank you. Comments are well noted, and this is just an important time for rec centers are an important piece in the healing process of this entire city. So thank you, Ms. Trueheart, for your comments, well noted, and thank you, Rec and Parks.
Before you go any further, Mr. Moore, I think it'll be prudent for you to get with our planning department, and who else is the planning department, along with the school system, to figure out how we can preserve our rec centers. If they have to tear them down, they need to be rebuilt. Okay.
And
So-
someone from our finance department.
Yeah, and from finance.
Involved, yes. And general
Service.
services.
So those agencies should all get together
Definitely.
so that we can make sure that we protect our rec centers as well.
Thank you, Director Moore. I will entertain a motion.
Madam President, Ms. Trueheart's protest having been heard and acknowledged, I move that the proposed amendment number 1 to the Memorandum of Understanding be approved and signature authorized, and the protest, while acknowledged, be rejected.
I second the motion.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The motion carries. The third item on the non-routine agenda can be found on page 54, City Council Bill 18-0298. Will the parties please come forward?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Jack Lattimore. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Friends of Gwynns Falls Leak and Park. We are a nonprofit organization that advocates and volunteers in the park. I've been authorized by our president, Bridget McCusker, to speak on behalf of the Friends. I also speak on behalf of numerous persons who live near the park and taxpayers of this city. The board's prior approval of the underlying agreement between the city and BGE in the fall of 2017, the omnibus agreement, and its approval today of the franchise ordinance clearly violates the city charter, which requires the board to conduct a diligent inquiry into the value of the franchise being granted, and it imposes a duty upon the board to fix the value at the largest amount it can obtain. The board did not undertake that inquiry or exercise that duty back in 2017, and it is surely not doing so today. The fact that this may be how franchise fees have been approved in the past is not an excuse, legal or otherwise, for violating the charter. The Friends made numerous requests to city officials and agencies to assist in developing a fair and adequate franchise fee. We were consistently rebuffed or outright ignored. The city turned to the Recreation and Parks Department to develop a fair value for the property. Recreation and Parks reportedly came up with a value of $14 million. The Pugh administration rejected this as unreasonable. The Pugh administration then agreed to accept a mere $1.4 million. One might wonder whether they just misplaced a decimal point. They accepted a merely $1.4 million from BGE. It is shameful, shameful to accept such a low value for 12.23 acres of this park, the second largest urban wilderness in the nation. There are examples elsewhere in the country of public parkland not nearly as unique as Gwynns Falls Leakin Park being appraised at much higher values. The city, and I've heard reference this morning to how poor this city is. This city is undervaluing one of its most significant resources. That may pertain to why the city is as poor as it is. They're undervaluing one of its premier resources to the detriment of the public and in favor of a hugely profitable corporation. The only way at this point to cure these violations of the law and regain the public trust is for the board to retain an independent consultant to conduct a fair and objective valuation of these 2.2 miles of parkland. That is all we ask.
Thank you. You can, and Comptroller Pratt, you have
Let me
a
ask you a
question?
Yeah. Who provided the Friends of Lincoln Park with the $14 million estimate?
I believe that was Reckon Parks.
Reckon Parks provided
Gotta
the
speak to the
estimate?
mic.
Our understanding is that Reckon Parks did their own evaluation, and they came up with a number of $14 million.
You don't have a copy of it?
No, ma'am, I do not.
Good morning,
Director Moore?
Board. Baltimore City Wrecking Park recommends a $1.4 million franchise agreement. And then the second piece I will acknowledge is Baltimore City Wrecking Park has never established a $14 million value.
State your name.
Good morning. I'm Dick Pervola from the City Law Department. I'd like to talk about the protest here. We have two allegations on the table. One is that this body, if it accepts the $1.4 million figure, will not have done its due diligence. And secondly, that if you do accept the $1.4 million figure, it's woefully inadequate. Both of those things are baseless. Let me go one at a time. The first thing about due diligence, just as an initial matter, this body hears hundreds of valuations a year. With that kind of workload, you have given the duty for due diligence to the agencies. The agencies come to this body, and at this point, you all query the agencies and ask if they've done due diligence, and as long as you are satisfied that we have, then you ultimately will agree or not agree with what we've done. So let's talk about the due diligence that we've done for this particular project. This project was in two phases. First was a right of entry, and then the second phase, and the first phase was always dependent on the second phase, which is a franchise, which is required by the city charter. So first phase, which came to you in 2017, you agreed to a $2.5 million figure for that right of entry. And that right of entry was based on three different buckets of money. That $2.5 million fund, one was $2.2 million for forest mitigation, which is required by the city charter. We had $60,000 toward a forest conservation fund, which is also required by the city charter. And we had $209,000 basically for general park maintenance. That came to a total of $2.5 million for phase one of this particular project, $2.5 million. This franchise fee, or the franchise bill, got hung up in city council. BGE came back and said, look, we will amend that amount. We'll give you another $600,000 on the right of entry. That $600,000 will come before this board in a few weeks, as I'm told. But so at this point, phase one of this project is a $3.1 million value at this point, $3.1 million value. So let's go to the franchise fee that's before you today. The franchise fee before you today is valued at $2.1 million, and we'll tell you how we got that. We have a formula that you all have approved. We use a minor fee schedule for anything that deals with a franchise. In the minor fee schedule, we have, if you have a pipeline, there's so much linear feet, there's a price tag per linear feet. So what we did was use the linear feet for this particular pipeline through this park, and we came up with something just slightly less than $1.4 million for the minor privilege fee or the franchise fee. But of course, we're not operating on right-of-way, we're working on park property. So we have another fee for degradation of the ecosystem. That's another $700,000 that we add to the $1.4 million. And then we had a deer census fee for $50,000. That's deer census and population management. All that came to a value of $2.1 million for the franchise fee. Now, BGE, after long, hard-fought negotiations with BGE, agreed to pay that, but they wanted to pay it in one lump sum. This is a 25-year franchise. They didn't want to pay it out over 25 years. They wanted to give you one lump sum right up front. And usually if we're talking about a stream of payments over 25 years that's given you on day one, that's a present value calculation. The present value calculation came down to $1.4 million. We asked our finance department if that's the proper way of evaluating our present value, and they said, yes, it is. So that's the fee that's on your desk, $1.4 million. The two phases together amount to a $4.5 million project and change. So that's our due diligence. That's the piece that we're talking, phase one, the allegation about we're not doing due diligence here. Each one of those steps is a very defined process in our charter or in our city code. And to the extent that degradation of our environmental system is not, we actually got a formula from Department of Natural Resources of how that would be calculated, and we use that in our franchise fee calculation. So let me go to the other thing that this is woefully inadequate. $4.5 million. We didn't do this thing in a vacuum. Interestingly enough, back in 1979, BGE put a pipeline through this very property. We charged the princely sum of $10,000 for that pipeline back in 1979. This particular project today is now 450 times greater than what we charged in 1979, 450 times greater. So the idea that this was a sweetheart deal with BGE is totally ridiculous. I assure you that BGE doesn't think so, because they were screaming and crying the entire way. When we got into the franchise piece, they were saying, but we're already paying $2.5 million. Why should we be paying anything more for a franchise fee? Well, that was a separate calculation, and we just went through the calculation of why we were adding more money to this. So two things I'd like to add. Whenever we talk about BGE, whenever we do a project with BGE, there are two things that we have to be mindful of. The first is that when BGE does a project, they are helping our citizens. In this case, we have a dilapidated pipeline. It needs to be repaired. They're going to provide gas service, better gas service to our residents. So their population, their clientele is our clientele. So that's one thing we're aware of. The second thing, which is even more important, when we charge BGE millions of dollars on a fee, it doesn't come out of their profits. It would be wonderful for us if it was just coming out from that. But what they do is they turn around and they charge their ratepayers. So ultimately, even though BGE money gives us money up front for whatever we're asking for, at the end of the day, they're taking it out of the ratepayers, and the ratepayers are paying us. So that idea here is when we get into a calculation like this, we are mindful of these types of activities. Bottom line is, this is 450% or times greater than we've ever charged BG for anything for the same pipeline, or a different pipeline, but the same property. And $4.5 million is not chump change. The idea that we could get more out of this, maybe 1,000 times more, which is what, actually more than 1,000 times more than we charged in 1979, if you would take the $14 million figure, to me, doesn't even seem reasonable. For the people who basically sat down with BGE and talked about these issues, I assure you that we think that we got the most value possible that we could get, and that was reasonable under the circumstances. So on behalf of the Department of Recreation, we certainly would like to have this $1.4 million approved.
Victor, thank you for your detailed and transparent testimony there. Is there anyone else that would like to add? And then Mr. Lattimore, you can respond.
Good morning. My name is Emmanuel Moore. I'm the manager for the external affairs for Baltimore Gas and Electric, and it's come to no surprise that we actually approve, or not approve, but we would like to see this approved. The purpose of this franchise is to allow us to continue to deliver natural gas services to Baltimore City and almost 650,000 natural gas users within our service territory. For these customers, natural gas is not just a comfort, but it's a necessity to heat homes, to cook, and to power manufacturing plants to allow for production of different materials. We see this as being an important project to sustain the livelihood of Baltimore City. Just to be reminded, this is a replacement project. There is already a gas main that's running through Leakin Park, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we repair and restore that infrastructure before it becomes useless. And I agree with what Mr. Victor had said, that we have done a lot of due diligence and working with the city and the community to explain to them how we plan to mitigate some of the construction impacts to the park, some of which includes reforestation, trail enhancements, ballpark field restorations. We value what the park brings to the city, and so we would like to see this approved.
Thank you. Mr. Lyra, you can respond to these
Thank you.
comments?
Yeah, I'm afraid Mr. Turville has muddied the waters. Actually, the first phase of a franchise ordinance of this process is not to grant an omnibus agreement. The first phase is supposed to be the franchise ordinance. And why is that? So that the city has the leverage to negotiate the largest amount it is supposed to get, which the charter also asks for. That is one of our problems. The city did not do that. They went ahead and allowed BGE to build the pipeline under the omnibus agreement instead of working and negotiating a franchise ordinance from day one, which is what the city charter calls for. And because they did it that way, they lost their leverage. They could not do their due diligence, and they could not negotiate with BGE to get the highest amount possible. It looks like a deal rather than a negotiation. The second problem that Mr. Turville has muddied the waters regards the package, the $4.5 million package. There's two parts to that. $2.7 million of that is from the omnibus agreement. That is for goods and services that were taken out of the park and some minor repairs that BGE agreed to do.
Madam President, if I may, I think we're getting far afield from the question presented by the protest.
Okay.
Now, we are in litigation with the Friends of Leakin Park, and I respect their right to bring a lawsuit, and we will see them in court when it's appropriate to do so. But I don't believe that Mr. Lattimore's present comments really relate to the protest, but now we're branching off into areas that are properly reserved for the lawsuit, which we will address in due course.
Okay.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. So just let me finish my comments, if I could. Respectfully, the franchise fee is a separate fee for what basically boils down to a long-term lease. Okay, that's not part of the $2.7 million package for goods and services that were taken out of the park. So all we're asking for today is for the board. We're giving the board today an opportunity to make this right. Do not sign the franchise, do not approve the franchise ordinance today. Obtain an objective appraisal for parkland because it's parkland, not undeveloped property, as some people seem to refer to it. Otherwise, as Mr. Davis mentions, we will proceed with our lawsuit. Thank you.
I will entertain a motion.
Madam President, if I may, briefly, Mr. Turville's presentation to the board demonstrates without question that due diligence has been satisfied in this instance. And if I may, any suggestion, I understand we're in a difficult environment these days with the uncertainty around city government, but any suggestion that any corporate citizen of this city or this state or this country gets special treatment from the lawyers representing this city must be categorically rejected by this board. The lawyers representing the Department of Recreation and Parks and every other department in this city follows one mandate in 3 parts: excellence, integrity, and transparency. And when the lawyers for this city sit down across the table from the lawyers representing our corporate citizens, they are fighting for the taxpayers. And so the suggestion somehow that the lawyers in the city law department don't fight with everything they've got on behalf of their client agencies is wrong. And frankly, it's offensive. All that said, Madam President, I move to reject the protest while honoring our friends who are friends of Leakin Park. We will see them in court. They will be heard by the judge, and it'll be a fair contest. But this ordinance should be approved by this board so that it can go before the city council so that we can bring closure to this matter. Thank you, Madam. That's my motion, Madam President.
I second the motion.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The motion carries. The 4th item on the non-routine agenda can be found on pages 65 to 67, Department of Housing and Community Development. Second Amendment to Land Disposition and Development Agreement. Will the parties please come forward? Good morning. Okay. The processing, where are they? Protesters, please come forward. Protesters first on this side here. State your name.
Hi.
You can come close to the mic, state your name.
Good morning. My name is Nia Redmond.
Good morning. Your comments, please, for your
Hi.
protest.
Hi. To give you some background, I represent over 700 families dislocated from a neighborhood called the Middle East neighborhood. I also represented, at one time, those residents on EBDI's board. I think I'm grateful to say that I was appointed by President Jack Young to sit on EBDI's board to represent those families that were being dislocated. Not to go far off of what my testimony is, but I need to establish the fact that I'm classified by Johns Hopkins as being bipolar, and that bipolar classification allowed me to sit on a board with 15 people that had academic and professional pedigree that I did not have to represent those families. Because had I not been bipolar, I could not have kept up with the musical chairs that happened at the board meetings at EBDI. That said, I came to really oppose what it is that EBDI is requesting at this time, simply because when I read the background history of the accomplishments that EBDI has purportedly accomplished in the last 15 years, on page 66, it says that EBDI completed the $53.1 million elementary school known as East Baltimore Community School, and that school was completed in 2014 with TIF funds. I'm here to share with you that East Baltimore Community School has never been completed. They have a space in that school called shared space. That space was supposed to hold an East Baltimore historical library. and to give access to residents in the East Baltimore community. Recently, the East Baltimore Historical Library has sat down with Miss Cheryl Washington here, whom I must say is a friend of mine, and also a person who comes from East Baltimore. And also, I'm glad to see 3 of you there who come from East Baltimore on this illustrious board. So you understand the rich history of the neighborhood that I'm talking about. When you have a situation where a school was built by EBDI for residents in East Baltimore's children, and they promised those dislocated residents that they would build a school which would house the East Baltimore Historical Library. The school has been open for 5.5 years now, and the East Baltimore Historical Library still has no home. Even though EBDI entered into an MOU agreement with the Maryland Historical Trust that they would put the East Baltimore Historical Library in that new school, both to the Maryland Historical Trusts discuss and residents discuss, we're still homeless. We still do not have a place to house the East Baltimore Historical Library. And that's due in part by EBDI coming before boards like yours, giving half-truths, sending in written testimony of things they have accomplished that they have not accomplished. How do you build a $53 million school and you leave the shared space incomplete that was supposed to house the East Baltimore Historical Library? Then you come to the East Baltimore Historical Library, which has been homeless for over 12 years, and ask us to use our bond bill money that we got from Annapolis to finish, complete building out a school that's owned by Baltimore City Public School System. Something just doesn't seem right about that. So I'm here today to ask you to postpone what it is that they've asked of you today, and I'm sure that must be a hard challenge for you. But President Young, when you appointed me to represent those residents in that neighborhood, you often told me, Nia, remember, you represent me, I trust you to fight the good fight. Well, 15 years later, I'm not on that board, and I'm still fighting the good fight. They do not respect us at the table. That's why they would come to us with a ridiculous suggestion to use our bond bills to complete a school that we'll never own. That's called sharecropping where I come from. The thing that I'd like you to do is postpone this until we can have a meeting with EBDI and residents in East Baltimore to determine whether EBDI has the capacity and the will to do the right thing by building out the rest of the acres in that area. And I thank you very much.
Could you comment from the city? State your name
My
and
name
use
is
the
Larry
microphone.
Jenkins. I'm with the City Law Department. I'd like to clarify first that the item before the board today is a second amendment to the LDDA, which was the document that years ago set up the whole master development for this area in East Baltimore. And the primary purpose of that document today is to extend the date out for until June 30th of 2028 so that this project, which has done a lot, can be completed. The things today that Ms. Redmond is talking about, which relate primarily to this library, which is within is supposed to be within the school building. Ms. Cheryl Washington, who is the president and CEO of the Baltimore Development Corporation, can address, because there's no real agreement in terms of between the city and EB Library as relates to this. So I'd like to have, before anything further, I'd like to have Ms. Washington explain the status of things.
Ms. Washington?
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. And I do want to first thank Nia. I want to thank her for her passion and for her commitment to East Baltimore. I share that same passion. She mentioned I'm from East Baltimore. My grandmother was one of the families relocated from EBDI. The reason I took this job working with the families was because I wanted to make sure East Baltimore residents were taken care of. And I find it nothing but God's grace that I am now president and CEO of the organization that is in place to make sure the commitments to the families and the community is fulfilled. So I wanted to first just reiterate what Mr. Jenkins said, that the LDDA that's before you today does not reference the East Baltimore Historical Library. There is no commitment or requirement that EBDI had to do anything for the historical library. Notwithstanding that, I also want to clarify the TIF financing that Ms. Redmond mentioned today. EBDI did receive approximately $85 million worth of TIF financing to support the acquisition, relocation, and demolition of the entire 88-acre project area. Those TIF financing documents that also did not reference the East Baltimore Historical Library. However, when EBDI came to realize there were going to be some unused TIF funds, we worked with the city, who consented for us to use those funds to build the East Baltimore Community School campus. It's a 7-acre campus that we feel is one of the hallmarks of our project area. That campus does include a pre-K to 8th grade school, the Henderson Hopkins School. It includes the Weinberg Early Child Care Center, and it also includes shared spaces, as Ms. Redmond mentioned. The auditorium, the green space, the gymnasium, the Family Resource Center, and other spaces are supposed to be used by the community, and many of them are. The construction budget included a line item to build out the core and shell of the space to house the East Baltimore Historical Library. If you drive down Ashland Avenue right now, you will see 3 historic row homes conjoined that is supposed to house the East Baltimore Historical Library. It was always envisioned to do that. What I understand happened is because TIF funds were used to construct the school and the shared spaces, those are public dollars. A private entity or private person cannot own that space. And I do understand that Ms. Redmond, because we all, the American dream is to own property. And I understand that Ms. Redmond would have liked the East Baltimore Historical Library to own that space. However, legally, because TIF funds were used to buy it, an impasse came. When the school opened, Ms. Redmond decided we needed to move away from moving into the school.
That's sad.
And so at this point, I'm happy. And so EBDI over the past 4 years, because the school opened in 2014. So over the past 5 years, we've worked with EBHL and Ms. Redmond trying to identify other properties in the East Eager Park EBDI footprint. Now I'm happy to report that a working group has been established. Ms. Redmond, the EBHL board members, EBDI, a consultant that EBDI has hired, is project managing this, where an architect has been involved, and we're now revisiting the historical library to go into the school. That site, that space where it was originally envisioned. So based on the process that I understand has been put in place, there is a process in place, schematic drawings. 85% of the funding has been identified to build out the space because, again, the TIF funding and the school construction budget did not call for retrofitting the space for EBHL's use. It was always envisioned that additional funding would be sought. And EBDI, working with EBHL, has gotten additional bond bill funding.
You have never worked with us to get bond bill money.
Just for clarification,
Yes.
so EBDI has had meetings with Ms. Redmond's group?
Yes, constantly.
Okay.
Constantly.
What's the total cost of construction? You're saying now you're in a...
Yeah, so the total construction cost to get EBHL into the school space is $631,000.
And you have 85% of that money.
85%, and a catalyst grant is pending for the remaining gap. So we've gotten bond bill funding, Johns Hopkins has given a grant, and then we have a catalyst grant pending. And so we envision in 6 months' time, EBHL can have the key, can open up and move into the space. So we have a planning process. We are committed to doing everything we can to get EBHL set up. And I liken EBHL and their mission to our other core values. EBDI is committed to making sure 1/3 of our housing in our project area are affordable, and not just affordable at the regular definition of 80% AMI and for sale, 50% for rental, but making sure that residents who were displaced have the opportunity to come back. We also have a community reinvestment fund to support small businesses and local hiring and workforce development. And we have a whole initiative called the Opportunity to Return for families to come back. Local hiring, economic inclusion are all core values of ours. So I just want to reiterate our commitment to EBHL, to working with Ms. Redmond and her board to make sure that this happens as quickly as possible.
So it's my understanding that today's amendment is only to extend the agreement. Many meetings can develop moving and going forward.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to request.
I just want to make a statement. This has been going on for a long time, and I expect for the library to be built out. I expect for Ms. Redmond and her board to have keys to that, because it's been dragged on for a long time. I know that it wasn't referencing the TIF and all the other things that you mentioned, but I do know that a promise was made that the Historic Library would be a part of that, because throughout that whole process, that whole project, there's nothing in that project other than the hotel that we can point to as a community that's ours.
Correct.
Okay, so this is very important to me, and I know it's important to Ms. Redmond, because the East Baltimore Historic Library can house a lot of things from most of the elected leaders in East Baltimore and some of the pioneers in East Baltimore who were business owners, restaurant owners, and shop owners. So I'm not hoping, I'm just directing you all to make sure that that library is completed within the 6 months and that she has the key to get in there.
Yes, sir. We're committed to that, too.
Comptroller Pratt?
Right, I'd like to make a request, Ms. Washington, that you report back to the board in November that the design and build has been completed.
I'd be delighted to.
Ms. Redmond, some final comments?
Thank you. My final comment is that I have to make a corrective. EBDI never helped the East Baltimore Historical Library obtain one bond bill. Our initial bond bill came in 2012, and it came from a little old lady named Delegate Hattie Harrison. She went to Annapolis, she fought, and brought back home $250,000 for a bond bill. EBDI had nothing to do with that.
We're not going to have no rebuttals on that. We want the library built within 6 months, and for her to have the key, and that's the way it's going to be.
And
okay?
for the record, though, we are not going to take our bond bill money and help build Hopkins School. No, we're not. So find the $600,000 somewhere else.
So my final words is that it's important that the meetings continue to take place and we keep things as transparent and efficient as possible. And on that note, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I move that the protests having been heard be rejected and the proposed extension be approved by this board.
All those in favor?
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The motion carries. As there are no more business before the board, we will recess until bid opening at 12 noon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The board is now in session for the receiving and opening of bids. I have the following addendum to note. Department of Public Works Sanitary Contract 955, Powder Mill Interceptor Improvements and Stream Restoration. Please change the bid due date from May the 1st, 2019 to May the 8th, 2019.
All right.
This is the only addendum for today.
All right, the addendum is noted for the record.
As there are no more bids scheduled to be opened today, the meeting is now adjourned.